Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Thriving Adoptees podcast. Today I'm delighted to be joined again by a fellow adoptee. I don't know whether listeners have picked up on this, but I'm really trying to get more adoptees on the show, because for many early in the podcast there were a lot of adopted parents. I just wanted to address the balance a little bit, and really get to the heart of what's going on for us adoptees. So thank you for coming on the show, Christine. Really looking forward to talking with you today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So when Christine and I spoke, we came up with this idea or this question to kickstart our conversation off, really. And the question that we came up with was, to what extent to what extent is reunion important in healing? So why, for me, why do you think that's an important question? I've got my take on that, but I'd love your take.
I think people get very caught up in reunion and what we see on social media and what you see on TV and in the movies. And people think that finding that other person is going to solve all the problems. And so when you asked me that question, how important was reunion to healing? I said, not very. That I think most of your healing has to come from yourself, and not necessarily being in reunion with the other person is going to do that, because you don't know what that reunion is going to do to you, or how it will affect you or your other relationships. So I think so much of it is dependent on ourselves.
Yeah. I love the word caught up, actually. I love the word caught up because we're caught up in a belief, aren't we? We're caught up in a belief that this is and they're all going to live happily ever after.
Yes.
Kind of like, so we're sold that story. Everybody's sold that story by I don't know whether it's just Hollywood, whether it's just Disney, or whether it's the UK media as well. But yeah, we are sold that story. The other thing that comes, you mentioned about TV. What I actually get from TV is the fact that it doesn't. So we have long lost family here in the UK, and I know you have that in the US.
Yes.
It actually came from Holland originally, that format, and then it's been adapted by the different countries. It doesn't always work out. It doesn't always work out brilliantly. What I get from it, and I haven't watched it recently because my wife doesn't like watching it and normally watching TV together. So what always comes clear to me is the birth mother's love for their child, and maybe before the reunion might not work out, but her love for her child is always very clear before the reunion itself, and that gives me that always triggers me in a good way and reminds me of the letter that I got in my adoption file that proved to me that my birth mother did love me. So that always gives me a warm feeling. But you're so right, it doesn't always work out. And we are caught up in it, and the thing that concerns me about that is that we're actually putting our happiness on hold. So we're saying to ourselves, I'll be happy when, right? So in the West, we have this we have this kind of cultural thing. I'll be happy when. So I'll be happy when I lose, 20 pounds. I'll be happy when I get a career. I get a career. I'll be happy when I get a promotion. I'll be happy when I get my mortgage paid off. I'll be happy when I get a new car. I'll be happy when. So that's the cultural kind of thing, is that we put our happiness on hold. And that applies in the adoption world, in our world as adoptees. That looks like, I'll be happy when I'm reunited with my birth mother. And because we're putting our happiness on hold, it means that we're not living our lives to the full in the moment. We are, delaying. We're delaying it. We're delaying feeling good. We're thinking that we're delaying feeling good, and we're also believing that feeling good comes from something outside us. So yeah, I talked quite a lot there, didn't I? It's a bugbear of mine, and that's those two things are really why I asked the question. When you said not really, I thought, yeah, this is really fertile ground.
So, my story was that I was a found adoptee. I did not search. I received a phone call one night from a woman who said, I think you're my daughter. And I found that to be a very traumatic event. I wasn't ready for that, had never considered that would happen. And it took a really long time for me to eventually engage with her. 15 years it took me. So at that 15-year mark, when I did eventually meet her and her two sons, and I was in a conversation one day with a half brother, and he said, was it worth it? Was it worth meeting us? And this was very early on in the reunion. I'd only met them a few months previous. And that was about 15 years ago. So, I really said to him at that point, it was never really about you guys. It was about trying to figure out for myself, why was it so hard for me to engage with them? And at 15 years ago, I was still at the very beginning of understanding why that was. But I still hold to that. It was not, for me, it was not about them. It was about trying to figure things out for myself. And whatever I have had with them over the years has been extra or bonus. When things were good, when things were more difficult, it was not so good or not bonus. But and I think for me, that's the way I look at it. That I needed to figure it out for myself. It wasn't so much about I need to find this piece or I need to figure this out with them, because I can't control how they feel, how they think, their experiences. So it might not work out for me if we're not on the same page.
Yeah. Wow, there's so much there. The first one I thought was, that's a really bold question, isn't it? A bold question. I don't know, but yeah, a bold question for your half brother to ask, was it worth it? It's kind of it sounds was he really concerned about your well-being, or was it?
I think so. And I think he wanted to know if I was okay. I think it did come from a genuine place in him. But again, this was 15 years ago at a time that we had only known each other a couple of months. He was definitely very understanding of my hesitancy. And, but at the same time, I think he was probably looking for a little validation of like, yes, I like you. Aren't we all? Don't we all do that?
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny because it seems like quite a risky question, but I guess he knew he was gonna get a yes, no, or a yes, no, or a fudge of it. I do get the impression from some of the things that I've the many conversations that I have for the podcast are with people from the other side of the pond, and I think that culturally sometimes you are a little bit more forthright than us Brits. But at the same time, you're more kind of like emotional. You're more happy talking about emotional stuff as well. And to me, like being more forthright and being more in touch with our feelings, are happy to talk about emotions. I find those two things are an odd combination, but perhaps I'm going down a rabbit hole there. It has been that. So how do you feel now? How do you feel overall now? I'm not going to ask you it as quite as boldly as was it worth it, but yeah.
What I usually say to people, what I usually say to people is, I think I will always be glad that I know my story. I know the who, I know the why, I know the when. I know all those things, and I don't take it for granted that so many people search for years and years and years and put a lot of hard work in, often put a lot of money in, often have a lot of heartbreak in their search. And that for me, literally one phone call provided me nearly all that information without me even asking. So I don't take that for granted. At the same time, I recently said, it's hard sometimes to explain that's something that other people are searching for or want so much in their life was traumatizing for me. That phone call was traumatizing. And so to that person who's searching, they might say, oh, I wish that happened to me. And it's like, oh,
yeah,
I don't know how to explain, that I am glad I know my information. And I'm glad I've had the opportunity to, just know those things about myself. But it's not been easy.
So I think that there's a you use the word caught up. We're caught up, and I talked about being caught up with the idea that I'll be happy when I get this, because I think most people are find through a search rather than being found, like yourself. I think what the questions bring in, the resolution, knowing the who, the why, and the when, that brings a certain amount of peace, because it's the end of the endless questions, isn't it? It's like it brings with it peace, and I think that's the that's the piece that we're all looking for, right?
Yes. I do know those things, and I'm glad that I know them. But at the same time, it's not a pretty story. So those little fantasies that a lot of adoptees will say, oh, I always thought my parents were, maybe they were famous, or maybe they were this, or maybe they were, royalty. I don't really remember having those. But I do think there is just a reality for just about every adoptee, the beginnings are not so great. Otherwise, we wouldn't have ended up adoptees.
No.
So, the circumstances under which we were conceived or born are not always lovely. And you do have to make some peace with that. But there's sadness to it. Very early on, right after I was found, I was talking to someone and, about some of that. And she said, she had 2 young children. She said, do you think if you go on to have children, they're all going to be conceived in some great night of let's make a baby. A lot of kids are born not that way. So, there's just reality to our stories. And the fact that you are maybe in reunion just doesn't erase all the sadness that comes along with some of that.
So I'm not quite sure how to phrase this. So is it a double-edged sword then? And this is an artificial question. I think I'm revving up for an artificial question, but I'll ask it anyway. So it's a double-edged sword. So you it's the end to the answers, but it may lead to a bad story. Which is better? Do you want prize A? Do you want bad story, an end to questioning, or prize B, bad story? Yeah, it's perhaps a little bit artificial, but I don't know. I've asked it now,
so that's that whole idea, especially back in the baby scoop era, of which I'm part of. I was born in 1969. That everything is win-win-win, right? Like my birth mother got a home for her child. I got a home with two parents. My parents who weren't able to have children got a child. Win-win-win. And, we're just trying to bring some light to that. It really is loss, loss, loss. And so even people who are on a search, I think people think when they find it's going to be a win. And I'm happy for people who find and engage in good, healthy relationships with other people and family members and all of that. I think it is wonderful. And but I think for anybody who is searching, whether it's a mother searching for a child or a person searching for their birth parents, there really needs to be some healthy reality to that trauma and that loss, and that initial meeting may be beautiful and wonderful, which is what is portrayed so often on Long Lost Family and those types of shows. But often once the dust settles, that trauma comes to light. And unless you're prepared to deal with that, and at the very least, acknowledge it, you're probably not going to have that great of a reunion.
No. So, did I tell you about me restarting my search? Did I tell you about that story?
I'm not sure. It
So
doesn't sound familiar.
Yeah, I was in a therapist's chair. This was like 7 or 8 years ago, I think. Yeah, maybe. And she was asking me about, my search, and I said, well, I've got a name. I've got my birth mother's name, but I haven't looked any further. And she asked why, or I can't remember exactly what happened, but she asked questions around that subject, and this idea, this picture came into my head of my birth mother being outside the door. And I'm sorry if you've heard this before, listeners. The idea of my birth mother being outside the door of the therapist's office came into my head, and I obviously I didn't know what her face was like, because I didn't know who she was. But this kind of vague idea of this woman came, and something about the picture that was in my head was a rejection from her, and I don't know what that was. What about her face? Something in a facial expression was rejection, and I kind of flushed cold in with fear of as I see it now. I'm making up to a certain extent the memory that happened in the moment, but I'm not, because it was pretty visceral. So I do remember. She rejected me again. I went kind of, I froze with fear of this rejection, and then I flushed full hot anger with, I'm not going to let this fear hang over my life, and I restarted my search, and as I say, found a few months later, 6-8 months later, when I got the adoption file, that my birth mother did love me and did what she thought was the best and made the plan before the baby happened. So, as you say, every story is different, but let me put it back onto you, because I've been talking too much about me, I think. You spoke last time about you learning how your brain worked. Now, was that kick-started by the traumatic telephone call from your birth mother? Is that what sent you down that avenue of trying to make sense of it and make sense of what's happening and come to peace with it? Is that right?
So I was found in 1992, but it was really not until 2007 that I more wholeheartedly tried to start to figure things out. I'd gone to therapy twice before. The very first gentleman said, "Do you want to meet her?" I said, "No." He said, "Then you don't have to." And I said, "Okay, thanks. Here's your check." And I walked away, and I didn't go back to therapy. I'm sure he probably wanted to say more to me. And if I'd gone back for a second appointment, he probably would have. But that's what I needed to hear in that moment, that I didn't have to do it. And I went to a second person a few years later, kind of a similar experience. And then it took until the third person. I think, if you're not ready, you're just not ready. And so by this point in my life, I was a little more ready to explore things. But still, it took many more years. So I think this idea of figuring out how my brain worked is really only the past couple of years.
Oh, okay.
And I think going to adoptee conferences and being a bigger part of the adoptee community, and probably a bigger presence of people on social media, which is definitely a double-edged sword type thing, but other podcasts and listening and just having a broader range of people who explain things. And I go, oh my gosh, that's me too. That's how I feel. And just exploring that a lot more. And I did a presentation about 1.5 years ago where I said, trying to explain these feelings and these thoughts to people who are not adopted or have not had some trauma in their young lives the way that adoptees do, is hard to explain in words. And I started to use some kind of just visual images and said, well, it's kind of like this, and explain it through kind of this visual modes. And people are like, oh, I get that a little bit more. And I started more frequently saying, hey, my trauma-based brain. And I think it was really, around 50 years old that I could more freely admit that I had this trauma. I could admit it on the surface a little bit for maybe the past 15 years. In the 15 years after she found me, I was like, oh no, I'm not traumatized at all. I'm just fine. That's why I don't need these other people in my life, because I'm fine. That whole I'm fine thing got blown out of the water pretty hard, and it's difficult. So, figuring out how my mind works and why I see things certain ways and why I feel things certain ways has been freeing.
Yeah. So some podcast hosts might say, so, Christine, how does your mind work? I'm not going to do that. Yes. Everything's everything is so reductionist, isn't it? Everything's so logical. You listen to shrinks, and I say this quite a lot at the moment. Shrinks are really intelligent people, and they can link anything with anything. They're like lawyers; they can link anything like anything. And I talk this. We watch a lot of legal dramas and cop dramas, and so you're watching a courtroom drama, and what one lawyer puts the case out one way, and you think, well, that makes sense. And then the opposite side comes on. Well, that makes sense too. And you're left like, well, what? And that's the thing, isn't it? Who's telling the truth, or who's closest to the truth? They can make anything fit with anything, and it's all logical, and it's all wrapped up, and it's all neat, and it's with a bow, and that's how mindset people talk as well, don't they? On all that sort of stuff. And what you said a couple of minutes ago was far more true in my opinion, which is you can't really put it into words. And you talked about using visuals. So on an audio podcast, I can't use visuals. So, but the closest I can get is often that the metaphor. And so I wrote this down. I think it was something that you said maybe at the last time that we called, and I'm going back to this idea of us looking for happiness in the wrong place, and the metaphor that we came up with, I'm not sure whether it's you or me, as I say, was putting our eggs in somebody else's basket. So we're saying my eggs are in my birth mother's basket. My happiness is in the hands of my birth mother, and whether she rejects me again, which was the fear that I had, whether she accepts me, whether or whether our relationship flourishes or not, we are putting our eggs in somebody else's basket. So instead of asking you, what did you learn about how your brain worked? Can you share a story or a metaphor or something that you found useful? Because sharing what we've learned is the essence of the Thriving Adoptees podcast. Your story is amazing, and in the show notes, listeners, as always, Christine has written a book, so get her book if you're interested in more about what she's learned and what her story is. But let me go back to that question. What could you share about what you've learned that you kind of can put into words that you feel could help fellow adoptees listening?
I just want to go back to one thing you said about the eggs in the basket. And I think being a found person, I felt like my birth mother put all her eggs in my basket.
Oh,
and I found that to be a heavy responsibility. Yeah. And I was 23 at the time.
Yeah.
All my children are now that age or older, and I look at them and I said, oh my God, I was that age when I was found. And you think you're an adult and you're just not. So, for me, I had to learn that, anybody else's happiness was not my responsibility, kind of thing. So I just wanted to address that part of it. But in terms of what I've learned about how my mind works, I just want to make sure I understood where you were going with that. Or about just.
So I could say to you, so what did you learn about how your mind works? But that's quite a a reductionist question.
Yeah.
So what have you got? Have you got a story or a realization or an insight or something that happened to you that helped you understand your traumatized brain?
So in this talk that I did, it was very interesting. You prepare for a talk and then COVID happened and the conference got canceled and rescheduled and all that kind of thing. And then I didn't work on it for a real long time. So when they definitely said, okay, we're going to have the conference, I opened my laptop back up and said, oh my gosh, I need to work on this. And it was only a few days before. So the talk that I gave ended up being a little more spontaneous than I had originally thought it would be. And a couple of times during the talk, that stream of consciousness kind of happened. And I started talking about something. I was like, oh, my brain's going, I didn't know I was going to talk about this today. But one of the examples that I used about my brain was about the delete button on our computers, or, that kind of thing. And I said, who else is kind of a virtual pack rat? I have every text I've ever sent and all the emails and all the photos and all that. I don't like to delete anything. And that really boils down to how easily our original identities were just deleted. And just that realization of, this is part of the reason that that's so hard for me, that, to realize that on a given day, somebody closed a file on my original identity and said, nope, she doesn't exist anymore. And I was born, and then I spent 3 months in foster care, which was very typical of the times here in the United States in the late 60s and 70s. And then I went to live with my adoptive parents. But I don't know where I was for those 3 months. I don't have any idea. And I used to not think about that time. I used to think I kind of came into existence when I went to live with my parents, even though I knew it was 3 months after I was born. But the older I got, the more I realized, like, wow, there's this chunk of time, this very critical chunk of time, the first 3 months of my life. I don't know who took care of me, or anything like that. And so this idea of, please don't delete me. Please don't delete me. So I don't like to delete other things. And there was that really resonated with everybody in the room. And there were a lot of people that said, yes, I feel that same way. But kind of that realization of, this is why, so the reason I don't like to delete things is because I fear being forgotten and deleted. And then I can talk myself through those things. Not always right in the moment of panic,
No.
but afterwards I can say, okay, you're feeling X, Y, or Z, and you're still here. You're a person. You're a real person, because we don't feel like we're real people when we don't have a name, and we don't, and even, getting my original birth certificate, I never thought I wanted it, because I did know from that phone call in 1992, I did know the people's names and that kind of thing. So I never thought that I wanted it. But then New York changed the law, and we were allowed to have access to our original birth certificates. And getting it was far more emotional than I had anticipated.
Yeah. So,
And
would you mind sharing your original name?
so that's kind of the interesting story, that when my birth mother found me, she said that she named me Rebecca Ann. But then I still have the paper. My husband wrote that night of the phone call. My husband wrote on a piece of paper as she spoke to him, because I was too hysterical. And he wrote the name Mary off to the side. And I don't know that I ever thought too much about that, but on the paperwork my parents had, there was a name Mary. So I originally thought my name was Mary for 23 years. And then when I got found, she said she named me Rebecca. So I didn't quite know. And then when I got my original birth certificate, it said Mary Rebecca. So I had a conversation with my birth mother, and I said, well, this is what it says. And she said, oh, yes, I wanted to name you Rebecca Ann. And the social worker said I couldn't, that I had to name you Mary. She doesn't remember why or whatever, but she was 20 or 21 years old and not in a position to say too much about it.
Or question the authority of the
absolutely. And that was, I had such rage about that thought, that here sits some person who has nothing to do with my life, this social worker or whoever she was, and says, no, you can't name her that. Knowing full well the name was going to get changed when I got adopted anyway. So why did somebody do that? And that was done over and over and over and over and over again. And it was so upsetting to just picture her at that age and feeling like, here's the one thing she gets to do. Give me a name. And they're going to steal even that.
Wow.
Very hard. And then, of course, my parents did change my name, which they had no idea that Rebecca was anywhere part of it. And even in the foster care paperwork, was that they called me Penny because I had auburn colored hair. So, no wonder we all get a little confused sometimes of like, well, is it Rebecca? Is it Mary? Is it Penny? My name's Christine. I definitely do, identify as Christine. That's been my name for as long as I've known. And I certainly know some adoptees who have gone back to using their original names. I'm happy for anybody in their journey who does what makes them happy.
Yeah. Yeah. My sister's still Penny.
Yeah.
So let me. I've said this to a few people, or no, I've said this, perhaps in some monologues rather than dialogue conversation, on the name thing. So I remember getting a sheet of paper with my birth mother's name on it, and that's what I thought I was getting. I wouldn't call it an original birth certificate. I don't think I've ever seen an original. It's just a crappy piece of paper that explains some printout from some government organisation, and it says my birth mother's name, Patricia Joan Flower, right? And then there's I think it's blank for the father's name. But underneath it, there was David Anthony Flower. And I don't think, this is, you kind of summed up your feelings at that time as anger. I would sum up my feeling at that time, that here's the piece of paper, as perhaps a little bit of, I would sum it up as fear, followed by confusion. But now this is probably 8 years ago, I don't know, 6 years or something like that. I can't remember whether I was expecting to read my original name or not. I don't think I was. But when I read it, I was like, huh, that's a bit weird. I've had two names. And I don't know whether the next question or the next thought, I can't remember where. I've had a thought since, and I don't know whether it was the thought I had at that time or when I was thinking about it, a few months or years later. And it's a bit of a weird question, or a bit of a weird thought. If I've had two names, I can't be either. Does that make any sense to you?
Yes, absolutely. I feel like, that struggle with identity. And it wasn't something that I realized until I was in my 40s. So that's, a conversation for another day when people are like, oh, I know somebody who's adopted and they're fine. I'm like, well, they just probably haven't explored it just yet. Because I was fine for a long time too. But I do get that, and that idea of identity and nationality and all of that kind of thing. I recently went through the 23andMe and Ancestry to find out my nationality more specifically. My my maiden name was Warmus, Warmus, and my dad, his family was from Poland, and my mom's German. But I always knew I probably wasn't those two things. But I used to, as a child, I used to say, "Oh, my dad's Polish and my mom is German." If a conversation came up about nationality, in school or something like that. So those things were true. My dad was Polish and my mom was German, but I would never address what I was because I didn't know. And then I married a Murphy. So you just become very Irish when your last name is Murphy. And I always said that was probably the best thing I could have done was marry someone with a very ethnic sounding name, Murphy. So nobody questioned it anymore. Like, oh, you guys are Irish. Yep, we are. And it turns out I am Irish and Scottish, kind of thing. But
Me too.
yeah, but that idea of identity, I still sometimes just feel like this little nebulous thing that floats around, not really attached to much of anything. And it's, if we attach ourselves to something, there's a danger it will be lost.
Yeah.
There's that
Completely.
trauma-based thinking,
So,
don't let me get too close to anything because I just might lose it.
so I recently did the DNA stuff, and you said Scottish and Irish, and I think I'm Scottish, English, and Irish. So my biological father, so I did a video this morning, which I'm going to release as a podcast as well. I haven't released it yet. So we're recording this on the 11th of January, listeners. On the 1st of January, on New Year's Day, I spoke to a cousin who found me through Ancestry, who has an Irish surname, and who's 9 years older than me, and she knows my birth father, and she knew him at the time that I was, conceived, born, etc. So yeah, and he has an Irish, he has an Irish name as well. It's not Murphy, but it's as Irish as Murphy.
Yeah.
I'm not going to mention it. It's pretty bland. I don't know this. So, but I don't feel as I was just like, oh, who am I? And I'd done a lot of emotional, how does my brain work way before I looked at the adoption stuff. So I was in a better place when this stuff came to light, right? So I say that the primal wound took me down, but if I hadn't done a lot of work before that, so I had a lot of emotional struggles around work, and I kind of addressed emotions through that stuff. So my identity was tied up with my work. If work was, and I was the owner of the business. So if the business was doing bad, I was doing bad. If the business was doing good, I was doing good. So I put my eggs in the business basket, right? So I've cleared out a lot of stuff. I'd learned a lot, but then when I heard about the primal wound, it took me down, but it didn't take me down too far. And when I found out the identity stuff, I'd also done a lot of work on identity as well. So I was very fortunate in that position. So it took me down, but it didn't take me down very far, and I bounced back. I bounced back higher, in my opinion. In my opinion, than I was before. And So identity is the thing, and I use this phrase quite a lot, and I use this metaphor quite a lot on the podcast and in the webinars that I do. And it's that phrase that we're not human beings having a spiritual experience. We're one spiritual being having whatever it is, 8 billion human experiences. So from spiritual being, I go to spirit, and I also like the non-religious word consciousness or awareness. So I identify at one level as Simon Jonathan Benn, at another level as podcaster, at another level as adoptee, and at another level as consciousness or spirit. And I feel that brings me grounding and security in my identity versus the chaos of Simon Jonathan Benn or David Anthony Flower. Which am I? You know, I'm instead of at that level, I'm down, and I'm wondering. First off, I'm thinking that sounds a little bit immodest. I don't know why. That's just how I feel. And another and I think this makes perfect sense to me, but is probably pretty way out to most people. And the third question, the third thing is just asking you straight out, to what extent does that make any sense?
Oh, I think it makes a lot of sense that I'm not sure if it, it's not the same as compartmentalizing, like, different parts of yourself kind of thing, but just knowing that we're capable of being more than one thing. We're capable of being more than one thing to each person we know. That kind of awareness. And, so it does make a lot of sense to me that we can understand that we have different roles with different people, and that's okay.
Yeah.
I think I'd have to maybe ask some non-adoptees about, that kind of thing. Do they feel that separating that out is helpful to them, or do they feel the need to do that? I don't know if that's something that people who...
I don't think I'm separating it out. I'm looking at different levels. So
yeah,
I'm not looking at different bags that are on the table. I'm looking at what's on the roof, what's on the ceiling, what's on the roof, what's on the bookshelf, what's on thing, and what's below that stuff. So let me try it in a different way, because
okay.
Let me try it in a different way that, and this might track for you and maybe completely off, because you spoke, and I've been, while I was looking across at my notes here, because I was trying to find something that you said, because you said that you talked about listening to God's instructions, right? So I'll just say it. Can I just say it in one sentence?
Yeah.
So I could. So for me, would this be similar? If I was a religious person, I would say, well, I found my identity, the essence of the strength of my identity, in seeing myself as one of God's children. Does that kind of track for you? Does that make any sense?
It definitely tracks for me. That so what we talked about last time was that, they're just, and things that I did write in the book, that, there were just different times that I felt God definitely spoke directly to me about certain things, to open certain doors and to fix um, certain things that weren't going so right for me. And that, it always astounds me. I don't know why it should continue to astound me at this age in my life, that God would have, such an interest in me. But I think that's normal for most people. We say, why is God so interested in my life? But I think it's important, uh, if if God is who you're identifying as a driving force, then listening to that voice, and if it's something different for you, whether it's your consciousness or your intuition or that kind of thing, I think it's important to just pay attention and respect what you're hearing. Um, so that was a big part of my story, was feeling that God was kind of driving what was going on, and the timing. And that's difficult when you talk about these chunks of 15 years and that
Yeah.
kind of thing, and say, you know I feel the timing was not necessarily on my own, and that time of 15 years was hard all the way around, um, but was necessary. I very much think that if I had met my birth family right off the bat in 1992, it probably wouldn't have gone too far. And I think she agrees, that even though it was very hard to wait, that there were reasons.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I want to take another. I don't think the timing thing. I bandy around my 8 years, and so I found that 8 years ago. I wrote to a guy who I think is my birth father, like 6 years ago, perhaps. I didn't get a letter. I found out 10 days ago, 11 days ago, where he is for sure. And we're like 99% is still alive. But I haven't yet called him, I haven't yet figured out whether I will do it. So it is all a matter of time. I wanted to go back to this identity thing, because I don't think I expressed it quite as clearly and elegantly and precisely and briefly as I wanted to do. So my security and grounding and feeling anchored lies in identifying myself as spirit or consciousness. I'm using those two words interchangeably. So that's my safety. And that doesn't change. That's the diamond that's hidden in the fist of trauma, in the fist that's clenching. And my equivalent for a religious person would be, if I was a religious person, I would express that same thing in different language, and I would say my security lies in being a child of God, and therefore my trauma is less important to me, because my trauma veils who I am. It doesn't. It veils me. It doesn't wound me, because I'm still a child of God. I'm still a child of God despite my trauma, and I'm still a diamond hidden in the clenched fist of that trauma. But that clenched fist of trauma cannot crush the diamond. It cannot. damage the diamond. It cannot wound the diamond because it's stronger than the diamond is stronger than my fist can do. Yeah.
I think that's beautiful. And I definitely, feel very similarly on my best days.
Yeah.
On my,
Yeah.
yeah, I don't mean to giggle.
Yeah.
Uh,
No,
I
me
don't want to
too.
take away from that. The whole time I was listening, I was enthralled by what you were saying. I was like, such a mature thought, but yet keep returning to I'm a child of God, child and such a mature thought.
Oh,
When,
right. Interesting.
yeah, when I'm not having a very good day in terms of something's triggered or my younger self is having, a difficulty and stuff like that, it's hard to remember those things. So
Yeah.
it,
The
it,
the
yeah,
the bad feelings
yeah,
hide who we are.
when you get triggered over loss or
Yes.
abandonment or
Yes.
unworthiness,
Totally.
it takes a lot of work to get back to that spot. And um,
Yeah.
there was a period in my life years ago where I wouldn't have even been able to try to get back to that spot. I would have just been like, oh, my life is terrible. Um,
Can I
I
take
have,
can I take a go at that?
yeah,
Can I take a yeah. Um we we don't need to do anything. We just need to see through the veil. We don't need to go anywhere. You mentioned it a couple of times. The first time I thought, forget it, Simon. Yeah. But they mentioned it again. We don't need to go anywhere. We need to see through. And that's impossible in the grip, as you say. When we're triggered, the diamond is obscured, hidden by the fist of trauma. No two ways about it. So all we can do is open the natural shape of the hand is open. So as we open, as we peel our fingers back, that reveals the diamond of who we are. But absolutely right. In the midst of trauma, in the midst of trigger, in the midst of anger being triggered, then in the midst of an insecure episode, then we completely lose. We lose sight of the diamond that we are because it's hidden by the feelings we're experiencing.
and that's just such a perfect example. And those were, that would fit right into the talk that I did about using kind of some of those visuals to explain things, because I think that's easy to understand when you're holding something in a closed fist. Well, you don't know what's in there. And you have to try to figure out how can you loosen that grip a little bit. And yeah, so I think,
I love the way you're taking the metaphor on. So, conscious of time, talking about consciousness.
yeah,
I'm conscious of time, Christine. So I just really love this conversation. I want to thank you for sharing this stuff so openly, and it's a different story, and yeah, it's brilliant. So, listeners, please check out Christine's book. I know I will be doing. Have you ever thought of doing an audio book? You haven't got an audio book, have you?
I don't have an audiobook. The book, I will just say, I wrote that book in 2007. So it was a long time ago, or 2008. I wrote it in 2008. It is very raw. It is very, it's even hard sometimes for me to read it now, because I said, oh my gosh, I was
Yeah.
in so much pain. But it's exactly how I felt at the time. So it's honest.
Yeah.
And it was about being found, and in the initial days of finally meeting my birth family, along with the loss of the brother that I grew up with. I'm not spoiling anything by sharing that my brother has passed away.
Sorry to hear that.
Yeah, thank you. And so it's very raw. It's called Taking Down the Wall. And And it was about having this protective wall around me. I always joke, if I'm going to write a sequel, I'm going to call it My Life as a Mason, and not the religious kind or whatever.
No,
I don't
no.
even know what masons are. A bricklayer,
Yeah,
because that wall goes up and comes down and goes up and comes down. That's life.
yeah,
Some days we feel a lot more open, and some days need protecting.
yeah. Me too. Thank you very much, Christine, and
Thank you,
thank
Simon.
you, listeners. You've been a star. Thanks for listening, listeners. Bye bye.